Hey, welcome. This is Intentism Show, the official podcast of the Intentism movement. Intentists are philosophers, they're writers, they're artists, they're musicians, they're actors, but we all maintain one thing, and we believe that all meaning is the imperfect outworking of intention. And these intentism shows just try and give some kind of voice to that. And this is new. We're very excited today because this is our first live stream. And we're hoping in the next few weeks to do more of these and hopefully interview various members of the intentist movement. And today is no different. I'm very excited that we have my brother, Luciano Pelosi, who is a writer and a photographer and an artist. And we're going to spend a bit of time speaking and interviewing him. So let me get my brother up on the screen here. Welcome, Luciano. How are you?
Good, thank you. Good to be on this.
Good to see you. Now, I guess the best way to start is to try and maybe dig a little bit back into your past and to try and find a little bit more about you. So we know you mainly, I would guess, for the photograph Big Breakfast. But can you tell us a little bit more about your background? And I know you've done a little bit of poetry in the past. What kinds of artistic practice have you been doing over the years?
I was fascinated as a child by literature, so I've always enjoyed the economy of short stories and poems. Um, and I remember as a child writing poems for my own pleasure as well as for those who would read them. And I love to see your artwork, and I found art to be visual arts to be beautiful and wonderful. But again, I'm somebody that likes to see things when there's economy and there's speed, and so the kind of art that I like to make is art that is like a poem, like a short poem, where it's an explosion of thought, um, and intentions move rapidly in the art creation process. And that's what drew me to photography. And I like the immediacy and the energy of it. I also like working with paint, but often with very um, using paint more as a sketching tool to produce rapid works of art that have an energy and vitality to them. Um, I I also like music, and I'm fascinated by how music has its energy and vitality too. And I love to see how various art forms are driven by the intentions, the creative intentions of their artists. And I'm fascinated in not only um, exploring my creativity, but also seeking to understand what's going on behind this, some of the philosophical ideas um, that that help me to understand my art as well as explore and express my art.
Wonderful. Thank you, Luciano. Well, I guess one way to ground this is to look at a piece of yours. Now, I said at the beginning, possibly the most well-known piece of artwork that you've made is Big Breakfast, which is a photograph, and I'll put it up on the screen, and we can maybe talk about it, and you can just run us through what your thinking, your intention was behind it. So let's just have a quick look at this together. Now, I've uploaded a page on our official Intentism website, intentism.org. And this is your work. It's a little bit cut off, but can you run us through what your intention was? It's beautifully shot. I love the lighting here, from dark to light, from left to right. It's very beautiful. But what was the thought behind it, Luciano?
What I wanted the artwork to do is to take you into a place of familiarity, um, a place of normality as well as familiarity. We're familiar with eating, but I didn't want special eating. I didn't want um, expensive restaurant eating, unusual eating. I wanted the normality of cafe eating, and what could be more normal than going into a cafe and ordering a tea and beans on toast, or in this case, spaghetti on toast. The unusual aspect is it's alphabeti spaghetti. And what I wanted to do is to take the person as if they are viewing through the eyes of the person eating, um, and as if they're viewing through my eyes as someone who's sitting there. And we see something that in first glance seems perfectly normal, but as we look at it more closely, that the letters clearly form words, and we're faced with a choice as to whether we are to acknowledge the words that are there in the photograph or not. And we by looking at it, we're forced to acknowledge that the wording there challenges us to think about ideas like random, ideas to do with how art is supposed to not be able to communicate by certain understandings. Art is not a communication between an artist and the viewer, but is an opportunity for the viewer um, to see the artwork as a mirror of their own ideas. And this is an opportunity for us to look at an artwork and see intention in the artwork, intention through the lettering. But it's also a kind of ironic statement about um, the art community and postmodern philosophy's desire to remove that, and for us to see artwork as just being means for us um, to appreciate objects on our own terms as critics, but not to explore the creative voice that goes on there. This is me shouting um, um, at the viewer that I have a creative voice, um, and that there's a humanity that is there, the imprint of humanity is there in the work itself.
Thank you, Luciano. Could you tell us a little bit more about your understanding of how intention affects our ability to understand irony? Because it's always been something that has meant something to me, that if we understand irony, we normally, one way of understanding irony is comparing the work, something that's the gesture, something that's expressed, with the intention of the person that's doing that gesture, and seeing if they're the same or compatible. And if there's some kind of dissonance, we often say that's irony. So obviously this work is particularly ironic. So can you say a word or two about irony and the art world, please?
I think we first of all need to start off by having an understanding of how our thought processes work. Um, I think that all creativity comes through intention processes, and these are intention processes about how we appreciate the world that we're in, how we experience and understand and find meaning in the world that we're in. Um, we create art for ourselves, and we the first and primary viewer of all artwork is ourselves. Um, we find that from perhaps the most pure form of art creativity that all human beings have, which is dreaming. And when we dream, we are being creative, and that's why dreams have influenced many artists such as Dali and Surrealism, and right back to people such as Coleridge and his poem Kubla Khan. The power of dreams to be a pure expression of creativity. But of course, a dream is to only be appreciated by the dreamer. And so I think what happens with ourselves is we can see irony ourselves. We can see something that ought not to be is there, and the internal surprise, but also amusement that we can have that things are juxtaposed, placed in ways that ought not to be. Um, if I go out and it's raining and I bring my umbrella, that's fine. But if I run back inside, get my umbrella, when I come out, the sun is beautifully shining. I sense something ironic happening there, and so we have our own internal processing of irony. And then what happens is when we see an artwork as being ironic, what we're seeing there is we're recognizing that the artist, the intender, has placed something that ought not to be there, a juxtaposition. In this case, the words being sort of messed around looks random, but then when we see the lettering clearly expressing words, what's happening is we realize as we look deeper into the artwork, it's not random. But then when the words say that the thing is random, that is something that ought not to be. That's a juxtaposition. And so we're challenged as the viewer to decide whether it's our internal recognition of irony, or whether we are seeing the irony expressed by the artists themselves. And we're forced to see that this isn't accidental because the lettering is too careful, and so we're forced to see that there was intention behind this rather than our own view of irony. And so I think when we look at irony in all artwork, what we're seeing is that juxtaposition. We're acknowledging that the artist has placed things that ought not to be next to each other to shock and surprise and amuse, and we're acknowledging this isn't accidental. This isn't our own internal irony, but this is an artist intention. It's not that we see a painting by one artist and a painting by another artist and we think, wow, this artist hated the other artist. I think this is ironic that these two paintings are together, because the actual artists would never have wanted to have stood in the same room together, but the two artworks are there. That's not about artist intention. That's about curation, the way the artworks are placed together. So there's an artistic thing going on here, but it's not about the individual artworks themselves. It's more about us being able to see something that internally amuses us. But with artwork that's ironic, we're seeing beyond that. We're being forced to say it's not us viewing it in an ironic way, but it's us seeing the irony, that the deliberate juxtaposition of things that ought not to be, as a creative exploration by the artist.
Thank you, Luciano. Nicely, clearly expressed as well. There's a philosopher who believes in intentionalism. I read a few of his essays, and there was one thing that he said that to me touched on what you're saying about the words or the letters seemingly being random, but then they're readable. And he speaks about how you'd feel if you're walking along the beach and the waves lap against the sand, then draw back. And as they recede, you can see what seems to be a couple of letters making out at the beginning of a possible word. And you think, well, is that a word, or is that just an accident of the way the water hits the sand and making shapes that look like letters? And then he says the next wave hits the sand and withdraws further. And this time, as it withdraws further, because perhaps the water is it's a time for the waves to be receding somewhat in the daytime. You see a whole sentence, and then you're left with the situation that these letters must have been put there intentionally by an intender. And I feel that there's an echo of that here, that there's too many letters spelt in words that make a sense as a complete sentence as well, for it to be random. So you need to find out what the intender is saying, even though the letters are expressing that there is no intention, there is no intender, and they're random. I'd like to just say one other thing as well about your work. I think your work is actually very powerful, and people might say it's echoed, or there's been an influence in your work with Magritte's "This Is Not a Pipe." Now, for those of you that don't know that, it's a very well known painting by René Magritte of a drawing or painting of a pipe, and then underneath it in French, "This is not a pipe." Now, there's a similar irony there, but I think yours, I think, is more powerful. A, because I think the image is more striking, but B, you could argue that with Magritte's "This Is Not a Pipe," it isn't a pipe. There is some kind of play there, and I'm sure Magritte was aware of this. That he's saying, well, in some senses, it isn't and never was a pipe because it's a painting of a pipe rather than a real pipe. But with yours, you're stuck in a corner. There's no escape route like with his work, with it being a real pipe or a illustration or a painting of a pipe, because these letters are clearly not random, but they're saying they're random. There's no alternative way of reading your work, which puts you in a real conundrum if you don't want to understand that intention matters. And this is a really powerful example of irony. Luciano, I just want to touch on a couple of other things before you go, because you're very busy, and we're really grateful that you've given us the time to speak to us today. A couple of things that you're saying that have been of interest to you of late, recently in your own artwork. One was how computing has influenced our understanding of the art. So, if you could just maybe give us a few ideas and just make that a little bit clearer for ourselves today, please.
Yeah, when I was younger, I was really into computing. I got ZX Spectrum, ZX81, these old little computers, and I learnt computer language. And later on, I moved on to other projects, other interests. But it always stayed with me the understanding that what I was learning to do was to write a language that was primarily for the computer to process and to go through a process of functions, which is um, um, I don't want to say it's the same thing as thinking, because that's a completely different philosophical argument. But it's a kind of proto thinking. A processing is probably the best way of putting it. And I think that the computer world um, has transformed our thinking, or at least it should be transforming our thinking in terms of how we understand intention and philosophy. Um, and a lot of the ideas around postmodernism was were being formed when computing was very much in its infancy, or there was no real computing to speak of at all. And so the whole idea of language being as a communication device, and the whole idea of language being a way that people can have look at shared expressions on pages and draw their own conclusions and find their own meanings, and whether there's anything such thing as an objective meaning at all. These ideas of no such thing as objective meaning, these thoughts, when they're placed next to the idea of computer language, are nonsensical, because computer language is a precise means by which words placed together um, allow for a processing of processing functions, which can be, as I was saying, similar to our thought processes. And what's exciting there is that we're then seeing language being about processing rather than about communication, primarily, that you can't communicate until you've processed. And what's exciting about the computer world is we see that a computer processes through language. And then because there's shared language, one computer can communicate with another computer. The shared language between an iPad and an iPhone means that they can communicate with each other. Shared language between computers means that computers can communicate with each other. And so what's exciting there is that we start to understand that the reason why I can communicate with you right now, the reason why my artwork can communicate with you, is that we are both share the same processing, and we both use language or symbols, different ways of processing that's shared. And the reason that it's shared is not primarily because the words are shared, um, but it's because we have a shared experience in the world. And so that's where it's very interesting to see someone like Heidegger and his understanding of being in the world, that rather than thinking of subject and object, we should all consider there's one simple thing, that everything exists in a world, and a world of possibility. That where that can take us is it can take us to an idea where um, we have a commonality, that you and I are both beings in the world. We're being in the world. And our shared humanity and existence means that I can communicate to you through art, imperfectly, but I do have a voice that expresses itself, and I can process, and then I can share those creative expressions, and you can take those on board and imperfectly share something with me, and it means I've got a voice. I've got an artist's voice, just as a computer has a voice that it can express to another computer. And I think what computing has done is it's given us a new way of exploring this and understanding this. And I think it means that the old idea of the artist being dead and the author being dead, and them being unable to communicate, and that there isn't a thumbprint of humanity in every artwork that we can see, but they're just effectively mirrors of our own understanding of ourselves in the world, is not only a tragedy in terms of our ability to have a voice, but also from a computing perspective, a wrong understanding of language and thinking.
Thank you, Luciano. It's very interesting. We've had this conversation before. Obviously, as brothers, we spend time together, and we've been talking a little bit about this, and we've been very fortunate as intenders to have some private exchange through emails with Professor Norm Chomsky, and it's very interesting that his ideas that are now sort of 40, 50 years old, but are still very controversial and we're still at the vanguard of how people understand linguistics. The idea of this innate grammar, this universal grammar, and the part of our consciousness, our being, that understands grammar perfectly or very, very well in a kind of congenital, innate way, he calls a language acquisition device. And it's interesting how there's a lot of computer terminology in that, and how language and linguistics and art has there's a lot of new terminology that's come from sort of the 1960s and 70s with computer science and that sort of thing. We'll have to wrap it up now, Luciana. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been great having you here. And again, thank you for anyone that's watching us live. There's going to be some hiccups, like I think that even my speaking looks a bit out of sync at the moment, but we're going to sort those out. One of the things we're most excited about with having people on, apart from getting for them just to let their hair down and tell us about their work and intention, is that we're building up towards showing a very exciting documentary about intentism. And simultaneously, we're going to have an exhibition. Now, we're aiming to have this in November, but we're hoping in the coming weeks to have various guests on who are going to be in the documentary and in the exhibition, talking about their work, showing you why you should be there. You should be watching the documentary and you should be at the exhibition, because we're very excited about it. But we'll let you know venues and times when we know ourselves. Luciano, thank you so much for coming. Have a good rest of the day. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us on Intentism Shows. Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.